From the MCADSV offices in Jefferson City, I'm Public Affairs Director Matthew Huffman, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition to connect advocates across our state. In this June webcast episode, I'm going to be talking with other MCADSV staff members, Nicole Crespi, Laura Zond, and Gail Reynoso. Welcome, y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to have all three of you here so that we can have kind of a roundtable discussion around LGBT Pride Month and what it means to be an ally to the LGBTQ community. All three of you, I think, bring very different but very unique perspectives into the conversation. So Nicole, you had done sexual health work on campus. Laura, you've been involved in the work for a long time. You were a director of a residential program. And Gail, I know a lot of the work that you've done both currently and in the past has focused around equal access to services and making sure that programs provide really inclusive services. So y'all are going to add a lot of really great perspectives to the conversation. So glad y'all are here. With that, if y'all could do just a quick, hey, here's my name, job title, and what I'm excited to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Nicole Crespi. I use she, her pronouns. My job title is Prevention Specialist, and I'm new here at the Coalition, so I'm really excited to be a part of my first ever webcast. And as part of it today, I'll talk a little bit about the LGBTQ plus acronym and why those words matter, why the language we use matters, and then how that goes along with prevention work.
And I'm Laura Zahn, Member Services Director. I'm just super excited about just being able to have the conversation because I do think that when we look at history, we look at currently what's going on, and also just the access to services. Because what we know for sure is that every person who's been victimized by domestic and sexual violence has the right, really, to get the services they need. Mm-hmm.
And I'm Gail Reynoso, Member Services Specialist here at MCADSV, and always excited to talk about accessibility, excited to broaden my own perspectives and think a little bit more about it. Every time we have these conversations, I learn something new, so I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Cool. Well, let's jump right in. So one, I kind of building on what you said, Laura, in terms of history, I wanted to just acknowledge the history of Pride Month. And so this year is actually the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. And I think that that's really important to recognize because in 50 years' time, we have seen huge markers of progress and social change in that. So one, just recognizing that in the Stonewall Uprising, that it was some really brave individuals who decided to take action that evening whenever police had a raid on the Stonewall Bar. And so, you know, as we've seen credited many times for it, Marsha P. Johnson, queer woman of color, threw the first stone. Yeah, you know, thinking about adding to that conversation, what it means to be a woman of color, to actually take that first step and the danger that you put yourself in. And then also just kind of thinking about, you know, in that marker of 50 years, we have also started to see that there is more of a grassroots effort to really start organizing around LGBTQ issues. So wanting to know kind of what are your thoughts on that? What do you see as markers of social change in those 50 years?
Well, it's interesting to me that it's a 50th anniversary, and it's about 50 years too late, but that within the last few weeks, it was the New York City Police Department, the chief, that did come out just recently and apologize for the police response. Whereas I think it was the year before or 2 years before that would not do that. Mm-hmm. You know, same person, but now, for whatever reason, the last 2 years has decided it really is okay for us to apologize for the behavior of the New York City Police Department. Because that wasn't the only raid there.
Yeah.
You know, that was a series of very heinous things that were happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that shift in attitude where now there's a level of accountability and saying, we're sorry, what happened there.
Yeah, and setting the stage for that. That like at some point there are many, many people who have done harm over the course of history, and for us to be able to follow the example of owning our mistakes and apologizing for them and promising to do better and working with communities to truly find out what would it mean to be better, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it also kind of reminds me of in those 50 years, we can talk about seeing those changes in attitudes, but that we also saw homosexuality taken out of the DSM as a mental illness. We have seen many states decriminalize any sort of queer activity. We saw marriage equality happen.
Right.
And so we can see these big shifts in attitudes. But going back to, Stonewall being considered that catalyst and what it means when we think about social movements and what sparks those even.
Yeah, and thinking about Stonewall, because I kind of feel like I learned it backwards. So I learned about Pride as a parade and a fun thing to do every summer, and learned it backwards that no, this came from. I believe that the first Pride sort of celebration was really a commemoration of the uprising and that struggle, and so it wasn't necessarily such a party. and maybe it's like a really positive thing that it's a party now and people feel free and comfortable, but we still limit it to like one day or 1 month in the year, and so it is important to learn that history and remember where it started, why it started, and that we should recognize that some of that violence is still continuing.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you bringing that up, the aspect of we know that violence continues, and so something that's been in the news in Missouri and nationally is, should police be involved in Pride parades, and is that a safe space if you allow law enforcement there, and that you can have a conversation both for and against that, also recognizing that I think oftentimes now we see the trans community being left out of those conversations quite often, and so how are we truly showing allyship to our trans sisters and brothers whenever many of them are the ones who are seeing the most violence? And so then how are we providing that safe space for them too? It also makes me kind of think about just history of movements in general. And so Laura, I know in a lot of trainings you've talked about the history of the domestic and sexual violence movement kind of coming out of the women's rights movement. And so can you talk a bit about some of those connections? Yeah.
So it was interesting when we look at the women's movement and then the DV and SV movement, I think coming out of that. In 1977 was the first National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas. And even during trying to figure out what the priorities would be, there was a lot of debate and conversation around our lesbian issues, women's rights issues. And so it was interesting as I was kind of looking at that type of history too, of like, that was a conversation that was very heated and taking place and trying to figure out, is that even a part of our, women's movement agenda kind of thing. And that, 1977 is not that long ago when we think about it. So, I think within the women's movement too, and we have talked about this as far as in our trainings and things that just in general, what I don't believe there was any ill intent, but it's within any movement, and including the DVSV movement, is who might it be leaving behind? Mm-hmm. Who might be being excluded, whether it was intentional or not. And so I think within the women's movement and DVSV movement, we have to definitely look at people of color, LGBTQ, and so it's not, I absolutely don't believe it's with ill intent, but it's always within any social change movement, who might we be leaving behind or excluding.
Yeah. And I think that is such a critical piece of the work in terms of just social change in general. And whenever we really think about diversity and equity and inclusion, that those don't become buzzwords, but we're actually doing really deep reflection and listening and thinking about who might be excluded, and being able to own that and atone for it at times. Yeah.
It just to point out, during that 1977 National Women's Conference, it was finally decided, yes, lesbian rights were women's rights, but, you know, where that went from there, and how possibly important it was of an agenda, I'm not sure that I have the answer on that. I also think within our history, it's really important to, with DV and SB, to also think about the number of, I'll say, women who maybe didn't openly identify as lesbian, but were definitely a part of starting programs, of being a part of this movement forward, but weren't necessarily feeling that societally and even politically that maybe it was okay to be open. So I do think we had a lot of folks that were in this movement that made the choice to stay closeted out of survival.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I think that is a really important piece of history. I also think it's really important to recognize that, you know, that could very well be the lived experience for many people now too. So recognizing that it is your own journey to come out, and when and to whom, and that's also a very real thing for many queer people, is recognizing on an everyday basis you have to navigate when and how it's comfortable and safe for you to come out.
Well, and within our own history of DV and SB, I mean, the majority of times when you're working in a program, the majority of times, at least what was being reported to you, it was an adult woman with an adult male abusive partner. And that's kind of how services were then set up, is kind of with that lens.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even thinking about that, how comfortable would somebody have been coming in and talking about an abusive partner that identified as their same gender, you know, just in general?
Yeah. You know, the other thing that it kind of makes me think about is that even inside of domestic and sexual violence, we know that it can happen to anyone, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of multiple identities. We know that also LGBTQ folks are at an increased risk of experiencing intimate partner and sexual violence. Yet I think we can't lose the very real gender dynamic there, that it is still gender-based violence.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes that can be a space that is a little bit harder for people to wrap their heads around. But what I have always gone back to, and I certainly am not going to take credit for this, it was a training I went to years ago, in which the presenter talked about, when we're talking about domestic and sexual violence, it's absolutely gender-based, regardless of how the person identifies that was abused and their abusive partner. And the example that she gave, which made the most sense to me, was when we think about when it is somebody who identifies as a man that is being abused or sexually assaulted, that regardless of perpetrator, but they are often called names that are primarily derogatory about women. So that in and of itself is a gender, is gender-based.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's still a very real gender framework and analysis to put into it. Yeah.
Right.
So I know that in a lot of our trainings, most recently, we've really been including pronouns, and that we've also been getting a lot of questions from members about the differences between gender identity and sexual orientation, biological sex, attraction. So I want to spend a little time just talking about why language matters, and that even LGBT as an acronym is ever evolving. And so that's why we often see LGBT plus because we know that there are a variety of identities included in that. So Gail and Nicole, since y'all have been doing a lot of trainings, a lot of regional meetings, can y'all kind of talk about just differences in language and why it's really important that we feel comfortable in this evolving acronym, evolving our language?
Yeah, and actually, just to start off, I would push back on the idea of feeling comfortable with new language. I try to use the most up-to-date language. I try to be aware of what's going on, but it's constantly changing, and I'm usually not very comfortable with it. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and be like, even if you are uncomfortable, keep trying.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so we've been trying to do pronouns. That was something that I learned on a college campus, and mostly by student-led groups, because I think college is a place where people are exploring and like deciding what language they want to create. And we started introducing ourselves with pronouns at meetings and asking our audiences to do the same. And it's been kind of a challenge because it is a little bit uncomfortable. But at least for me, the point of using pronouns and introducing myself with pronouns is to be really clear. I think language is important, so I want to be clear with how I would like to be addressed, so that I get the level of respect that I think I deserve. And I think it also can send a signal to the people that I'm with to say that I'm also interested in learning what your pronouns are and what makes you feel respected and comfortable, and I'd like to use those if you're willing to share them with me. So it's a loaded little 3-letter word that I share.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I think this is the benefit to having diverse staff and new voices and ideas, because I think it's something that I haven't traditionally been thinking about doing. I understand, pronouns like a basic understanding, having been through some training, with KCAVP and some of those folks who've provided us some training, but watching Nicole do it, like watching her model that, and then seeing folks respond to that and seeing the space open up a little bit for folks to practice using their pronouns, and then to sort of see a space where we're acknowledging that that gender identity is fluid and that there is not just one way or two ways to be has been really good practice. And I think it's changed the atmosphere in the room a little bit and maybe made other conversations more easily held. I think it changes the space. So I'm grateful that you've been setting that example.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so funny because in this space, I am that person who keeps pushing at it and keeps bringing it up, and that has never been my role before. I've always been like having other people remind me. So yeah, like just it's going to depend on what space you're in, how comfortable you are doing something. And part of that is that it keeps on changing. So like right now, I'm looking at this graphic that I keep seeing shared on social media, and it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 letters in our LGBTQ plus acronym, and that is a lot to keep up with. And I know for a fact that there's at least like 4 or 5 that I know of that I have friends who identify with these other ones that aren't even included. Mm-hmm. It's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that that kind of sigh and just acknowledgement that it is a lot, and for also pushing back on me of being comfortable in it, because yeah, I mean, we are constantly pushing ourselves to learn more and to really be able to sit with the fact that people can't be put into boxes, and we have to get out of that framework of everyone fitting into the box that we've grown up learning of in terms of how we identify. And that's not always comfortable, but it is a really important thing for us to continue to practice. And so, yeah, thinking about the graph that you're looking at, are there resources that folks have found really useful and tools that y'all feel like are worth sharing out?
I think one of the most useful things that I've ever found is to just ask the person which pronouns they prefer, ask the person how they identify. yeah, that to me is the best tool ever, is just to be able to listen to the person themselves. Because I don't think there's any one thing out there that's going to capture everything, but how can people just be?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, completely. Like, listen to people, talk to people. And so I think that social media, obviously we can talk about social media forever and the challenges and all of that, but I think that social media can be a good way for people to listen, even if in their daily lives and like actual interpersonal interactions in the real world, they don't meet people who identify very differently than them. So like, if you're feeling like I'm not learning anything because my friends don't know anything about this either, a really cool opportunity is all of these different social media platforms where people are sharing their stories, people are writing about their daily experiences, they're sharing the way that they identify either like sexual orientation or gender, and a lot of them now have been like over years, and so you can see changes. People share their journey as their identities really adjust to their life, and I think that is awesome. And I wish I could think of some like usernames to drop, but I don't know any. But just start looking around, start following people online that you wouldn't normally, and read and like listen to what they're writing about their lives.
One of the best experiences I've had here at the Coalition is a conference in St. Louis called Trans Spectrum. And I've only been once, but I'm hoping to go back every year. It's held in St. Louis, and it was just a phenomenal experience. So as we were just talking about sort of this way we put people in boxes, to be at this conference where these boxes were really intentionally deconstructed, and there was just really open, accepting space for folks of all genders, all sexual orientations, all gender expressions, was just a phenomenal experience. Sort of being in a person who doesn't necessarily sit in those spaces all the time. And so I learned a lot there about being uncomfortable and about hearing directly from people about what they need. So we're going to talk a little bit, in a few minutes about language, but that was, I think, a place where I really learned a lot.
Yeah, and I want to like bring it back to, I think it's really easy to want like a layout, a handbook. This is what you need to know, and just follow it, and you'll be good, and you won't offend anybody, and like it'll be fine. And unfortunately, I don't think that exists anywhere.
Not when you're working with people. I mean, that's just, there's not a handbook.
Yeah.
So that being said, like, don't not read what people publish and what people post, but maybe read a lot of it and take in what you think makes the most sense and try to reconcile like different opinions and different perspectives. Because every time you see that acronym, somebody's going to have a different idea of what those letters mean. And I want to throw out one resource, which is it's a website called, it's pronounced metrosexual.com. And the person who runs it created a genderbread person, which was my first introduction to gender and sexuality, kind of all being different, and like, what do these all mean? It was the first place I heard actual definitions. And I think we're on version like 4, although that was released in 2017. I'm sure there's way more updated versions. But the main thing is that it's a really simple graphic representation. It's got colors. It's easy to explain to anyone, all different age ranges, and it keeps being updated. Even though it was the thing that we taught in classes, it keeps getting updated because things keep changing. So keep reading about stuff, and remember that it's going to be different next week. And that's great, because you just learn a little more.
Yeah, because we keep learning. Well, and Gail, I know that you and I have talked about seeing others present on the My Gender Unicorn, which the first time I was introduced to it, I thought, wow, what a really cool resource and representation in terms of the way that they are using the gender unicorn to talk about gender identity and sexual orientation and a person's attraction template. And also recognizing that was a resource that was created by queer youth because they felt like there was no other place that they were getting this information, so they wanted to create something that more accurately represented their experience and what they needed to hear. But you also got a really interesting take on that.
Yeah, so again, at that Trans Spectrum conference, there were workshops of all different levels, and so I went to a really basic one, just sort of on pronouns and language, and they were talking about this unicorn visual, which again, as you did, I found really, really awesome. It was a really cool resource, and it was very helpful to me. But there were a couple of trans youth in the audience who said to the presenter, how do you feel about this illustration of this fantasy creature? Like, is that dehumanizing? We are human beings, and the only way we can describe our, diverse experiences in the world is to create this fantasy creature. And so then that sort of put a whole new spin on it, which really makes me think then about how important it is to have so many voices in the room, and that we will come to like a consensus in one room, and then have a space with new voices at the table, and that consensus isn't going to make sense anymore, or may still make sense for some people, but not for new voices. And so sort of making sure that we're always learning and growing and being open to that. And when we were talking about comfort earlier, I think the comfort comes from feeling like we know things and we're not going to make mistakes. So I want to be comfortable with this language, so that I do not make a mistake, so that I do not offend someone. But the fact is that we do not learn in places where we are comfortable. We only learn when we're, sort of fumbling along and making mistakes and learning together and challenging each other. So that's the difficult part, right, of being human and connecting to others. So as Nicole was saying, reading lots of diverse voices and going, to these conferences and sitting in spaces where folks are using language you've never heard before, and then asking questions and practicing, but also being willing to recognize that you're going to think that you learned it and you got it, and then a week later you're going to realize that no, that's not at all what I thought, or oh, there's this new thing now, I have to learn this new thing. But really embracing that, that language matters, and that it is ever evolving and changing, and that we just have to keep learning and growing and evolving with it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that whole, like, being uncomfortable, and I think there's a lot of areas that it's like we need to be able to be comfortable in being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting just to me and just some of the work that I've done is, my hope is that sometime in my lifetime that we actually can all sit in a space in which there is space for everyone. And so those things around being uncomfortable has more to do with we're not there yet. So yeah, that's my lifelong goal and journey is for all. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's that we all, it's not about how you identify, because it won't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but the importance is not around how I identify, because all are included. Mm-hmm. So if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, this might even be a topic for a future webcast. But it's kind of thinking about the differences between equality and equity.
Yes.
And how we really work on making that distinguishing realization that equity and equality are not the same thing.
Right.
And the process that we have to go through to get to both. But yeah, I mean, something that I really appreciate that I want to lift out of what the three of you we're talking about is that, in order to feel comfortable with something, we have to sit in that uncomfortable space of acknowledging we don't know everything, and that isn't a bad thing, and that we do learn and get better, and to be true allies in this work together is to continue to read stories and share stories and continue to have these conversations.
Yeah, and that's rough. Like, it's not easy.
Yeah.
To feel like admitting that I don't know everything. I feel pretty confident that I do a lot of the time. I looked at a gingerbread person. But yeah, like being ready for that language to change, and then taking the time to understand why it does matter, because we don't want it to. Like, it shouldn't.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
But recognizing, like, why does it matter? And I think a lot of times the word that comes up is like privilege. Recognize your privilege, and that's how you know that it matters. But I think even that concept is like really complicated. So bringing back this website that I mentioned earlier, there's a checklist. It's called the 30 plus examples of heterosexual or straight privilege. And it's just a list of examples of life experiences that you might have if you are straight or in a relationship with someone of the opposite gender, although I would say that's not a very inclusive phrase either. But if you're in a straight passing relationship, then you might not deal with a bunch of issues. And instead of highlighting, these are all the issues that people are facing and you should, feel empathy and feel sympathy for them, more like go through this checklist and think about, do you have to deal with any of this stuff? Like, or is it going okay? And so why does it matter that you would identify as part of the LGBT community or not? Why do those words matter? Why does it matter what all of these letters stand for? And the reason is how it's affecting people as they live in the real world. And we don't know, like, I don't know until I go through those checklists.
Yeah.
All of the things. And honestly, I would say I saw it the other day again, and I got through like 6 out of 30 and just felt so awful that I couldn't read it anymore because I don't want to think about how bad we're treating each other. But it's important to take some time to like sort of humble yourself and think about how you're doing okay in certain areas, even when everything else seems like the worst.
And it's a similar exercise as the privilege walk that I know we've used. Didn't create it by any stretch, but I know we've used that at different trainings around cultural relevancy and those conversations. And what I found is, yes, there can be a lot of privilege guilt when you're going through but I'm not sure that the guilt is actually going to help. It has more to do with what am I going to do internally, but also externally that helps change that. That helps try and have all people at least starting at the same, in the same space, in the same time. And I think I think a lot of the work that we do, you can go to all the training in the world, and it can be fantastic. But unless you are willing to work on you at a personal level, you might be standing in the way.
I like that, yeah. And
yeah, I like that.
I almost feel like the guilt piece should be part of the cycle of change. Have you guys seen like the phases of change? And I almost feel like the guilt piece for any work where we're examining privilege, and we're all sitting at those intersections of privilege and oppression, right? Based on our numerous identities, that guilt almost needs to be one of those things that you have to feel and then work through, because I think it's a natural gut reaction to suddenly feel shame over things. Again, I think it's because we didn't know, and I've hurt people, and I'm ashamed by that, especially in this movement where our goal, I think, is inclusivity and to move forward together. But to be able to unpack that with people you trust and care about, and who care about you, to not take that into these spaces with you, because that's one more burden, one more piece of privilege you're carrying forward as the guilt that gets in your way. So I almost feel like it's something we need to acknowledge, that yes, we do feel that, and we need to go work through that on our own, and then come back to the table.
Find a good therapist. Work on it on yourself. Please don't play out. Don't play out your guilt with everybody else while you're trying to do it.
Yeah, very good.
You need to take care of you. As those in the prevention movement had said for years, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's so important, and that's like a perfect example of being a good ally. I think is like figure it out. You're gonna have to figure it out on your own.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to be uncomfortable. You're gonna have to take your discomforts to a place where, yeah, you might be healing yourself, but you're also not harming anybody else at the same time.
And you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And you need to be okay with being called out on those mistakes.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you have to be okay with being called on things, because otherwise we will never learn or grow. And kind of to your point of being, Gail, to your point of being okay with that guilt, there's a way of being humble and learning and accepting people's feedback without automatically being on the defensive with things.
Was it Brene Brown says, like, moving from shame to vulnerability? So, like, moving past the space of, like, oh, shit, or oh crap, I did that. And so moving forward to, and I made a mistake and I know better now. And how am I going to continue to learn and grow, make amends, be a better human, a better advocate, a better teacher, whatever it might be.
Well, and to move that forward just a little bit, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about how we as individuals in the work can do our own work, work on ourselves in order to add to the movement and better the movement for all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about implications for our work. What do we think implications are for preventing sexual violence if we look at it through the lens of being true allies to the LGBTQ community?
I think it's like what Laura was saying, trying to make sure that everyone is included. And I think the only way, at least for me, to do that will be to recognize who's being affected first and find that out, and not only say like, oh, rates of violence are a lot higher for the trans community. These people are more at risk. We should support them, but actually including the voices of those people that our data is showing are most highly affected. So I wonder, like, how many times are we asking and listening to those perspectives and listening to not only the negative experiences, but the ideas for positive change that people within those communities that we say are so at risk are coming up with. Going back to the beginning of our webcast, we talked about Stonewall, started with Marsha P. Johnson, a trans woman of color, standing up. And it wasn't that somebody in a position of power identified her or her community as needing assistance and they went and helped. It was that she did it and we followed her lead. So
good point. Yeah.
So really trying to figure out who's affected, how are they affected, what are they saying they need, so that we can address that.
I think that a lot of times I base prevention on the differences in how I remember growing up and seeing the world and how my niece and nephew see the world. I spent a lot of time with my niece and nephew, love them dearly, and have had any number of amazing conversations with them. And have worked really hard on them since birth, to make little activists here and little advocates. They're not little anymore, they're 22 and 18. But I know things around gender identity. They don't hesitate to just talk about her and her girlfriend, him and his boyfriend. That is something as I was growing up, because I'm old, but that's something as I was growing up, people didn't talk about. I mean, that was a secret. People were not open, and when they were, that was, you just didn't talk about it, kind of thing. So I look to them often to be like, to actually see the change.
Yeah.
Because I sometimes I can get very bogged down in this world sucks, kind of thing. But I look at them and I hear how they talk, and I hear how things that were secretive or or seen as negative or whatever as I was growing up, it's almost, not to diminish it, but it almost is not a non-issue for how they see the world in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, kids know what's up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
they
they do.
know what's going on. They're so smart.
Yeah.
I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important kind of marker of social change too, right? Because we can see that, in our work we often talk about prevention is social change, advocacy is social change, public policy is social change. And so we can see it through these really specific ways of noticing social change. But for young people, it is just inherently part of who they are.
Right.
And it's such a really cool thing to see because young folks are so smart and they know what they need already and they're willing to tell you and take action on it.
Yeah, and I think it makes it easier for us, right? Because we can just follow their lead. I mean, they've got it. They know what they're doing. They know the world they're growing up in, and they have so many answers. Like you said, it's a non-issue. So why are we making it an issue sometimes? And it goes beyond that, and things are complicated. And like you said, like policies take a lot of time to change, and so like there are things that are affecting them that they don't know about, and that's our job, right? But learning how we should speak to each other and how we should think about these issues, I think, we should follow their lead. Yeah.
Well, and I also want to acknowledge that we do have some really strong and inclusive policies. So in our MCA DSV service standards, we set a really high expectation for inclusive services and having strong policies. Gail, would you and Laura maybe speak a bit about those?
Yeah, so knowing that our MCADSV standards for domestic and sexual violence programs were created by our members, is really empowering, knowing that our programs came together and decided that there was a certain level of service that all survivors should receive. And then, just sort of going through the accessibility pieces are woven throughout the standard. There are some specific things, like if you're looking at the DV standard, there's specific language in here around non-discrimination policies, around lots of intersecting identities, including sexual orientation, gender, and also in our standards is included the information from the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013, talking about, again, programs not being able to discriminate when they're receiving DOJ funds based on sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc., and sort of outlining what that means. So it's not just like as easy as like don't discriminate. Right. It's what does it mean to serve folks in your programming, and do you provide sex segregated or sex specific programming? Is that an assumption that it's necessary to provide services that way? How can we provide services to folks across the board? And then if we are providing sex segregated or sex specific services, are those comparable services? Are they equal in quality? And what does equality, what does equity and equality, what do those things look like? There's a difference, right? Allowing folks to self-select into the group or service that corresponds to their gender. So not gendering people, but allowing folks to identify for themselves their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, not making assumptions about a person's gender identity based on their gender expression. So there's a lot of guidance in here that I think is really helpful that, again, the programs themselves developed.
And then, I would say the majority, if not all, of, let's say, domestic violence shelters were not set up in mind to have men or those that identify as men in shelter. A lot of them were like in big old houses or small houses, but they were in houses. It just wasn't set up that way. So I do know over time what programs have looked at is whether they're building or expanding, those kinds of things is what could it look like so that we can have space that can be more inclusive, which also goes back to, I think, programs looking at, for years, and bed space is still at a premium, and it is still incredibly important, but around do we need to overall look at, should somebody coming in without children, should they be able to have their own room? should they be able to have their own room and bathroom? And how we've had people share room. I mean, there's a whole other probably,
In a future episode.
Yeah, a future episode
we'll get
about
down into that.
Why did we think it was a good idea to put that many traumatized people in one room? I'll never know. But aside from that, it's like creating space so that you could be more inclusive. Yeah.
And what Nicole and I and our coworkers were hearing at some of our recent regional meetings where we were talking about the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative and we were talking about sexual assault services and who we are serving, these conversations kind of extended into different identities. And are we serving men? Are we serving trans women? Are we serving folks who maybe express themselves more in masculine ways? And there were programs who were saying, we did not think we could serve men effectively in shelter. We made some changes. We faced a situation where we could no longer refuse, and we did it, and it worked. And here's how it worked. And it would be different, just as every single survivor who comes into shelter has a unique experience, and every single group of survivors has a unique dynamic. That changes regardless of gender or sexual orientation. And so it was kind of cool to hear people saying, we've tried this and here's what we're doing to make it even more accessible or even more comfortable or even more equitable.
Well, and even when somebody may have had a bad experience or a less than stellar experience, basically I can flip that in any different way and say, has that ever happened before, regardless of how the person identified? And the answer is probably yes. It's just for whatever reason, it's like, oh, we had a man in shelter and this happened. And it's like, okay, but let's think about what happened and has that ever happened before? And yeah, it probably has. One of the things I know too, that so many programs did not have people identified as men on staff for years. And I do remember when that started happening and it would be like, can we hire a man? Should we? And it's like, well, actually, employment, you can't discriminate because of gender either. But, and then the wonderful experiences of having a more diverse staff in that way. It's interesting because I know that a lot of people, a lot of advocates have said, well, we may be afraid to bring men in, because most of the women here were abused by a man. So could that be triggering? And I don't want to dismiss that. Absolutely, it could be. But with that logic, to really simplify that, if you have a woman in shelter whose abuser was a woman, how does that not do the same trigger with all the women that work there and live there? Right. If you just try and simplify that out a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've talked before, Laura, about not necessarily being able to avoid every trigger, but helping survivors to manage triggers.
Yes.
And
triggers are normal. And how do we talk to survivors about there's any number of things that can be triggering, and so how can we safety plan around that as well?
Yeah, I think we've also heard from some programs with male staff about how great it's been for heterosexual survivors, female identifying survivors who have experienced intimate partner violence by someone they identified as a male, to have a good male role model, to have someone who does model appropriate behavior, and same with the children, to have role models of folks in shelter who are behaving the way that that good, decent, honest people behave. So we've heard that there's a real healing aspect to that at times.
And I think that as far as our access for services, I do think there will be an ongoing conversations, because I think sometimes what we might be hesitant to talk about is, I think the biggest fear for a lot of advocates and programs is providing services to men who identify as straight and for transgendered individuals. I really think that those are going to be further conversations, but I think that it's conversations I'm not sure that we're actually having a lot of, but I think that's some of the biggest fear that sits there in services, residential services.
Yes. And that's what we heard when I just recently went to all 7 regions for the first time ever, and And that was one of the questions we heard a lot was like, well, how do we serve trans survivors? How do we serve non-binary survivors? And some of those were just like questions left hanging because people don't have an answer.
Yeah.
Like, there's no handbook. They're like,
Right.
we can't just pull out the handbook and say this is how you do it. And then some people were like, oh, we already do that.
Yeah.
We've just been doing it. It's just, we just keep doing business and it happens. And so, like, really encouraging people to have those conversations, even though you might stumble and say the wrong word, because you might stumble and ask a question that feels uncomfortable. And, you know, we're sitting here having this conversation, so y'all can do it too.
Yeah, that's right.
And it, you know, as far as how do we provide services, I'm going to go back to survivor-defined advocacy. I don't know until I talk to the person. What is it you need and what is it you want?
Right, yeah.
And
letting them lead the conversation
Exactly.
and actively listening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know the services you provide.
Yeah.
Here's what is offered. What is it that you need and want?
Yeah.
And if there's something beyond that, just advocacy is you're looking for those other resources that you can connect them with.
Yeah.
And I think that's perfect. Like, yeah, listen, talk to people,
Yeah.
like we've been saying. And you don't have to go into those conversations completely unaware of where it might go, because there are some resources out there. Like, for example, the National PREA Resource Center shared their model policy on transgender, nonconforming, and intersex youth and how to serve and protect those children while they're in that communal living situation. And so obviously these won't apply to every single person, but there's definitions, there's ideas for intake, confidentiality, clothing, bathrooms, healthcare, all kinds of different topics that you can go in and just get some idea of, like, what is the scope? What are we even talking about? And then get into individual conversations and obviously serve survivors in the way that you do every day.
Yeah. And we also know, just based on conversations with advocates at member programs, that many advocates are finding creative ways to provide inclusive advocacy because they are listening to survivors, and they are really making a point to say, how can I help you in ways that are going to be meaningful? And so that's the other part about this work is, if you are feeling in any way uncomfortable as an advocate in your skills, it's okay to sit in that uncomfortability, because
Then you're probably doing it right.
yeah, you're doing it right. You're listening, and you can reach out to the coalition. You can reach out to other advocates at member programs. But yeah, that's a really important aspect of the work.
The only people, survivors, you know, are some of the most creative and amazing people I've ever met and worked with. The only people that come right close are advocates. I mean, we do just incredible, amazing things.
And to come back to the space of that we're serving whole people.
Yes.
And so, like, gender expression, gender identity, like, those might be things that aren't even obvious. And to go into a conversation with someone where the only thing we're focused on is does this person identify as a trans man, and what do I do if they do? But to just recognize people as whole people, and that this is one aspect of their entire lives, and it is important, but it is not the only thing that we should be honing in on or worrying about or overthinking, which I think also comes from that space of wanting to do well, that we start to overthink things and really hone in on them, sometimes more so than we should. So
Yeah, very well said, Gail. So I want us to kind of wrap up by talking about LGBTQ representation in media, and ending on some of our favorite representations. I think it's really important for queer people in general to see other queer people represented in media. And we also know that queer youth really want that as well. And so there is just a really important aspect of representation and how important that can be. So kind of just wanted to go around and have us share our favorite maybe movie or TV show, musician, or just queer artist in general. So I don't mind getting that started and playing my cards, putting them out on the table. I'm going to say both my favorite and then my problematic favorite. Because, going to be honest with them there. So I read a book last year called A Little Life, and it was about a group of friends who went to college together, maintaining their friendship after college. But it's a group of men and queer men, and the way that they talk about trauma and relationships and sexuality, I thought was just such a really great way of showing how masculinity can mean something different to different male-identified people, and how friendships and relationships can really evolve over time. And the author did a really great job of that. It is triggering in parts, and it took me about 4 months to read all of it, but really good and well-written book. My problematic favorite... It's the L word.
That's mine too, Matthew.
Yep. I mean, maybe not the best representation of lesbians and gay men, but, Laura, as we've talked about, in terms of a soap opera...
Primo entertainment is a soap opera.
Yeah, really good entertainment.
Yeah.
And, thinking about representation, I remember whenever it was on, I was in college, and we would get together and have viewing parties, and that was a really important space for me to sit in with my community, of us being able to watch that.
Yeah. I was so not in college when that was on. I was way out of college. But no, as I was thinking about entertainment, but that was one of mine. As soon as it's like, oh, this is a soap opera, okay, that spun in my head a little different way. But I can remember a TV show called Soap back in the 70s. And Billy Crystal, that was the first, played a character named Jody. That was the first time that I remember an openly gay man represented on TV. And again, that was a comedy soap opera, 30-minute sitcom, but it made an impact, I think, on me. And then as I was thinking about other things, first of all, I watch way too much TV and movies, but...
no such thing.
Okay. But I think things like Will and Grace are definitely a guilty pleasure of mine. I was thinking of the new show Pose, that's now a new Ryan Murphy show that's out. I think, and I know this is, depending on when this airs, I think Orange is the New Black starts tomorrow for its final season. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what I have seen over time, I don't know that I can name a favorite. What I've just seen is more representation, and that it has gone from this big reveal of Billy Crystal as Jody on Soap to it's just part of the script now, and it's not always a big reveal. And again, I'll go back to my niece and nephew. It means nothing to them. It's not like this super important, there's going to be this kiss between two men or whatever, like it used to be, kind of thing. I also think what has shifted is that there is more, it's not where it needs to be by any stretch. There is more representation of people who identify as LGBTQ plus actually playing characters that represent how they identify. Yeah. And that is something that has definitely changed over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that there's more diversity within the characters. So, it used to be, too, there was a token gay man on a show, and it was the same character every time.
Right.
And now you have this broad, deep diversity of characters, just really, actually mirroring what life is like, what real humans are like, which is exciting. I
also had made a note that I watch Riverdale. Sorry, I am a fan, but even within that, I mean, it's a storyline that's in there as well. But it's like, oh my gosh, I just watch trash all the time, don't I? It's like,
let's talk about coping mechanisms.
Exactly, it's my self-care. So
But Pose is amazing.
Oh, Pose is awesome. Yeah,
goodness. And the second season came out recently.
Yes,
or at least a few episodes have.
They're about 3 episodes in now.
And, I thought I would have, music to share, but I don't. I watch a lot of TV, too, I guess. So on Netflix, the 2 shows that I highly recommend are Sex Education. Oh, yeah. I taught sex education when I was in college, and so that's why I watched it. But it is really cool. It's kind of like a silly premise because it's about this teenager and his mom is a sex therapist, and like you can imagine the hijinks they get into when friends or like schoolmates come over to their house for a school project, like so much silly stuff. But it's also a really cool show about like high schoolers learning about sexuality and how high schoolers talk to each other, and it comes with this underlying message about like that is actual sex education involved, because this one high school student just happens to know so much about sex and sexual health because of his mom's expertise. So highly recommend. It's really funny and sweet because they're adorable going on dates. Anyway, and the other one is called Special. And I've only seen one episode so far, but it was really cool. It's about a man with a developmental disorder where people just assume that he doesn't have sex or just isn't interested in sex or anything. And it's like goes through him having sex for the first time, talking to his friends, and he's a gay man, and so it's just like a lot of conversations that I've never seen on a TV screen before, and have been trying to make happen in college campuses, trying to get students to talk to each other, and I'm like, just go watch sex education. It's funny. Yeah.
I think you guys listed a lot of shows I enjoy as well, but I think there's a book I wanted to throw out there. It's called This Bridge Called My Back. And it's an anthology of writings by radical women of color, many of whom also identify as queer. And there's these awesome, amazing essays, like funny and sad and poignant and deep and meaningful on feminism, and then the intersections of race and gender, sexual orientation, class identity. And it was just a phenomenal book. It's one of my favorites.
Gail reads more than some of us. I just watch TV. I did want to throw out one other just documentary that, because we haven't like touched on music, and it was "Wish Me Away," and it's Shelley Wright, who was a country music singer, and it's her story, and because she was in country music and definitely up and coming and exploding, was scared to death about identifying as a lesbian because of what that might do, because in country music, you didn't come out.
Yeah.
So, and to the point where she talks about being kind of set up, even with like Brad Paisley, and she couldn't even tell him. So they're dating, in air quotes, kind of thing, and she breaks up with him, and he's like, but she was like, I couldn't tell him, kind of thing. So. So within music, I mean, I think that within other genres of music, it's taken a while, but it's become a little more okay. But in country music, that is still that's still not happening.
Yeah,
so
maybe not the safest space.
Yeah. And then I want to credit like Ellen DeGeneres, and she lost her TV show over that announcement, but I remember watching that episode where she comes out, and then she's laughed all the way to the bank after built her own production company and is on Monday through Friday, it just has taken that show just tremendous ways.
Yeah, she took a big risk, but it's now really paid off for her, and as a good example of being able to be a queer person and have a really successful career and not have to be so worried about that. All right, well, thanks, y'all. I think we all have a new list of things to be watching and reading, and we also had a really good conversation. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, and happy Pride.